The rope felt heavier than it should have. Thomas Whitmore adjusted the coarse noose around his own neck, the fibers scratching his skin like a final, cruel insult. Below him, the entire town of Copper Ridge had gathered. 200 faces, maybe more, all twisted with a thirst for blood they called justice. They stared up at the gallows, their eyes filled with righteous anger, eager to see him swing. They wanted justice for what they thought he had done. What they didn't know, what not a single soul in that dusty square could even imagine, was that the real killer was standing right there among them. He was watching, and he was smiling. 3 months earlier, Thomas Whitmore was practically a king. He owned the biggest cattle ranch in the Arizona Territory, a sprawling empire of dust and grass. 47 men took his orders, and his name carried enough weight to make politicians in Phoenix clear their schedules. Respectability was his shadow, and his future seemed as certain as the sunrise. Then came the morning that burned it all to the ground. The news hit him like a physical blow, an Apache raid. The eastern pasture was a graveyard of dead cattle, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth and blood. He saddled up, taking 6 of his best men, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The government's promises of protection were worth less than the paper they were printed on. It was always the ranchers who paid the price. They found her by a dried-up creek bed, half buried under a fallen cottonwood. Blood was matted in her long, black hair, and her simple dress was torn, a silent testament to a desperate fight. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her high cheekbones and bronze skin marked her as Apache. His foreman, Jake Morrison, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years, reached for his pistol. "Boss," he grunted, his voice low and final. "We ought to finish what someone started." Thomas didn't answer. He just looked at the woman's face. Even unconscious, bruised and broken, she had a dignity that silenced the rage in his gut. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny flicker of life in a world determined to snuff it out. Whoever did this had left her for dead, but she wasn't dead yet. "Load her in the wagon," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard as stone. Jake's eyes went wide. "Thomas, you can't be serious. After what her people did to our cattle?" Thomas's gaze snapped to his foreman, cold and unwavering. "I said load her." The ride back was dead silent. His men kept shooting each other looks, their thoughts screaming what their mouths didn't dare say. The boss has lost his mind. In their world, you didn't show mercy to an Apache. It was an unwritten rule, etched into the very soul of the territory. Shoot first, bury the body, and never ever ask questions. But Thomas couldn't get the woman's face out of his mind. He carried her into the ranch house himself, ignoring the scandalized gasp from his housekeeper, Maria. He laid her on the guest room bed, the clean white sheets a stark contrast to her battered body. He sent a rider to fetch Dr. Hendricks from town, knowing full well the storm he was about to unleash. The doctor arrived 2 hours later, his bag clutched in his hand like a shield, his expression sour. He'd seen what Apache raids did to settlers. He had no sympathy to spare. "Thomas," he said, not even trying to hide his disgust, "what in God's name are you thinking?" "Just examine her, Doc." The doctor's report was grim. She'd been beaten savagely. The wound on her head wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to crush her skull. But she was a fighter. With care, she would live. "She needs rest, food, and clean water," Hendricks said, packing his tools with sharp, angry movements. "But you're playing with fire, Thomas. When word gets out you're harboring an Apache. There will be hell to pay." Thomas knew. He'd built his life on calculated risks. But this wasn't a calculation. This was something else entirely. A gut feeling he couldn't explain. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and for the first time in his life, he was about to jump without looking down. He just hoped he wouldn't drag everyone down with him. She woke up on the 3rd day. When Thomas entered the room, he found her sitting bolt upright in bed. Her dark eyes were wide, alert, and filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. She tracked his every move, her body tensed, ready to fight or flee despite the agony it would cause her. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice low, gentle. He held his hands out, showing they were empty. "No one will hurt you here." She didn't speak, but her eyes never left his face, searching for the lie. Slowly, over days of quiet persistence, the story came out in broken fragments. Her name was Ayana. It meant eternal blossom. She was from a small band led by her father, a chief named Grey Wolf, who had tried to make peace with the white settlers. 3 nights before he found her, a group of white men had descended on their camp while the warriors were away. It wasn't a raid, it was a slaughter. They killed the old, the weak, the children. They took what they wanted and burned the rest. Ayana had watched from the brush as her entire world turned to ash and screams. When she tried to run, one of them caught her. He beat her, his face a mask of rage, and left her for the buzzards. The story made Thomas's stomach churn. He'd heard whispers of vigilante groups, ranchers who believed the only good Indian was a dead one. The law rarely looked too closely at these things. It was easier not to. "My father will think I am dead," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her English was surprisingly good, learned from missionaries in her youth. "They told me your language would help bring peace." Thomas looked at her, truly looked at her. The healing had brought color back to her face, and a sharp intelligence shone in her eyes. There was a strength in her, a resilience that was both humbling and terrifying. She was like tempered steel. "Where would you go?" he asked. "If you left here?" "North," she said without hesitation. "To the mountains. My father has winter camps there. If any of my people survived, that is where they will be." The smart move was obvious. Give her a horse, supplies, and point her north. Problem solved. Clean hands, clear conscience. But as he looked at this woman who had survived a massacre, something held him back. It was the way she talked about her father, a flicker of hope in her eyes that defied the horror she had witnessed. He couldn't just send her out there alone, but he was about to find out that keeping her would cost him more than just a horse and some supplies. It was going to cost him everything. The first real trouble arrived on horseback. Sheriff Duncan Mills and 3 deputies rode up to the ranch, their faces grim and official. Mills was a man who wore his ambition like a well-oiled gun. He'd been the law in Copper Ridge for 8 years, and he knew which way the political winds blew. Right now, they were blowing against Thomas. They sat on the porch. The deputies stayed on their horses, their hands resting casually on their holsters. It wasn't a friendly visit. "Word is," Mills began, swirling the coffee he hadn't touched, "you've got an Apache woman staying in your house." "Word travels fast," Thomas said, his voice even. "Is it true?" Thomas met the sheriff's gaze. "She was injured. I gave her medical aid." "Thomas, you know I respect you," Mills said, leaning forward, his voice a low warning. "Your family helped build this territory. But harboring an Apache? It's not just dangerous. It's political suicide. There are folks in town calling you a traitor." "And what do you call me, Duncan?" The sheriff shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. "I call you a friend who's making a damn big mistake. There have been 3 more raids this month. The Hendersons lost their boy last week. People are scared, Thomas, and scared people do stupid things." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Mills said, his eyes hard. "Send her away, tonight, before this gets out of hand." After they left, Thomas found Ayana standing by a window, her back rigid. She had heard every word. "Your friend is right," she said quietly. "I should go." "Go where?" Thomas countered, turning to face her. "Your people are gone. Winter's coming. You're not even fully healed." "I will not be the reason you lose everything you have built," she said, her voice fierce. He looked at this young woman, this survivor, who was more worried about his reputation than her own life. In that moment, he felt a surge of defiance so strong it startled him. He had spent his life building his ranch, his reputation, his wealth. But what was any of it worth if he had to sacrifice his own conscience to keep it? "Let me worry about what I might lose," he said. The decision was made. But as he watched the dust settle from the sheriff's departure, a cold knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't just a warning from a friend. It was something else. Mills hadn't seemed concerned. He had seemed nervous. And that's when the first seed of a terrible suspicion began to take root in Thomas Whitmore's mind. The consequences came faster than a flash flood. 3 of his longest-serving ranch hands quit within the week. They packed their bags and left, refusing to work for a man who would shelter the enemy. They wouldn't even look him in the eye. Then the suppliers in town started making excuses. Deliveries were delayed. Prices went up. Suddenly, the credit he'd had for 20 years was no good. The weekly poker game at the Silver Dollar Saloon, a ritual for 5 years, suddenly didn't have a seat for him anymore. Old friends and neighboring ranchers, men he'd shared whiskey with and fought alongside, came to his door. They didn't come for coffee. They came with hard faces and harder words. They told him his actions were endangering everyone. They spoke of a unified response, of the need to show strength. His compassion, they said, was a weakness that would get them all killed. Thomas listened patiently, but with every word his resolve hardened into granite. He saw the fear in their eyes, but beneath it, he saw something uglier. Greed. They didn't just want the Apache gone. They wanted their land. But as the world outside his ranch gates turned on him, a strange new world was being built within it. Ayana was not a helpless victim. She had a deep, almost mystical knowledge of the land. She taught his remaining hands which plants could heal and which could kill. She could calm a spooked horse with a touch and a whisper. She could read the earth like a book, tracking game across terrain that would leave the best hunters lost. More than that, she began to fill a silence in his life he hadn't even realized was there. His wife had been gone for 6 years, and the sprawling ranch house had become an empty shell, a monument to his success and his solitude. Ayana's presence brought a quiet warmth to the cold rooms. Their evenings grew longer, filled with conversation. She told him of Apache legends, of the spirits that lived in the mountains and the rivers. He told her about his boyhood in Missouri, of the long, hard journey west, of the dream he'd built in the unforgiving desert. "Your people fear mine because they do not understand," she said one evening, as they watched the sunset bleed across the sky. "They see only the warrior. They do not see the grandmother telling stories to her grandchildren." "Fear makes people stupid," Thomas replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Is that why you help me?" she asked, her gaze direct, cutting through all his defenses. "To prove you are not stupid?" Thomas thought about it, truly thought about it. The angry faces in town, the betrayed looks from his friends, the mounting pile of debt. He was losing everything. Why? "I helped you because it was the right thing to do," he said, the truth of it settling deep in his bones. "Everything else is just noise." But the noise was about to get a whole lot louder. The first attempt on his life came on a moonless night in November. He woke to the sound of shattering glass in the sharp, oily smell of kerosene. A bottle, stuffed with a burning rag, had been hurled through his bedroom window. Flames were already licking at the curtains. He grabbed the rifle he kept by his bed and raced to Ayana's room. He found her already awake, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a fierce, burning anger. Together, they beat back the flames, their hands and faces smeared with soot, their lungs filled with smoke. They saved the house. But the message had been delivered, written in fire and glass. His protection of her had made them both targets. "This cannot go on," Ayana said, her voice shaking with rage as they stared at the charred wall. "I will not watch you die for me." "Nobody's going to die," Thomas said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. He knew he was lying. The situation had escalated past warnings and threats. This was no longer about public opinion. This was about silencing them. Permanently. Sheriff Mills arrived the next morning. He surveyed the damage, and Thomas saw it clearly in his eyes. Not surprise, not concern, but a cold, grim satisfaction. "I warned you, Thomas," Mills said, almost conversationally. "This is just the beginning." "Are you going to investigate? Find out who did this?" Thomas demanded, his voice raw. Mills gave a lazy shrug. "Investigate what? A lamp knocked over? A stray spark from the fireplace? No witnesses, Thomas. No evidence. Nothing I can do." He looked Thomas dead in the eye. "Maybe you should have listened to me." The sheriff's words chilled him to the bone. No witnesses, no evidence. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a promise. Whatever happened to him and Ayana out here, it would be their word against the world. And their world was getting smaller by the second. The isolation was a physical thing, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered everything. As winter tightened its grip on the high country, Thomas felt himself being completely cut off. The banks that once begged for his business now refused to see him. The territorial politicians who once took his calls now acted as if he didn't exist. His empire was crumbling, brick by brick, and Ayanna watched it happen with a growing sense of despair. She was fully healed now, strong and capable. She could slip into the desert like a ghost and be gone, making her way north to find what was left of her people. Every day she stayed, the price went up. Another friend lost. Another business deal soured. Another piece of the life he'd spent 40 years building turned to dust. Why? She finally asked him one night over a meager dinner. The food on their plates was a stark reminder of how much they had lost. Why sacrifice everything for me? Thomas put down his fork. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the fire in her eyes that no amount of tragedy could extinguish. Because some things matter more than cattle and land, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Because right is right, even when it costs you everything. If I lose this ranch, then I lose it. But I'll still be able to look myself in the mirror. He reached across the table and, for the first time, took her hand. Her fingers were slender but strong, and they wrapped around his without hesitation. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer a rancher and a refugee. They were partners, allies, two people against the world, and the world was coming for them. The attack on Christmas Eve was meant to be the end. Just after midnight, 8 men on horseback surrounded the ranch house. They weren't a drunken mob. They were organized, armed, and determined. They wore masks to hide their faces and carried torches to light their way. They had come to finish the job the firebomb had started. Thomas had been expecting it. He had barricaded the windows, positioned rifles in every room, and planned his defense. He had told Ayanna to hide in the reinforced cellar, to stay down no matter what she heard. He should have known better. As the first shots rang out, shattering the silent, holy night, Ayanna didn't hide. She slipped out the back door, armed with a powerful war bow that had belonged to her father. She moved through the darkness like a phantom, a spirit of vengeance born from the ashes of her people. The attackers were focused on the house, on the lone man they expected to find inside. They never saw her coming. An arrow hissed through the night, and one of the men pitched forward from his saddle with a choked cry. Another arrow and a torch fell to the ground, its carrier slumping over, a feathered shaft protruding from his throat. Panic erupted. The attackers spun around, firing wildly into the darkness, but they were shooting at shadows. Ayanna was a ghost, her position marked only by the silent, deadly flight of her arrows. Inside, Thomas used the confusion to his advantage, his rifle cracking, adding to the chaos. The siege was over in minutes. It ended with 3 attackers dead, 4 wounded and dragging themselves away, and 1 survivor galloping frantically into the night, his face a mask of terror. Thomas had taken a bullet to the shoulder, a searing line of fire, but it was a clean shot. He would live. Ayanna had saved his life. In the aftermath, the smell of gunpowder and blood hanging heavy in the air, something shifted between them. The careful boundaries they had built, the unspoken rules, they all came crashing down. As she cleaned and band-dressed his wound, her touch gentle but sure, he looked at her in awe. "You could have run," he said, his voice hoarse. "In all the chaos, you could have just disappeared." "I could not leave you to face them alone," she said simply, not looking up from her work. "Why not?" Her hand stilled. She finally raised her head and her dark eyes locked onto his. "Because you are mine to protect now," she said, her voice filled with a fierce, undeniable truth. "Just as I am yours." The words hung in the air, a confession and a promise. In the bloody stillness of that Christmas night, Thomas Whitmore realized he was no longer just protecting a woman he had rescued. He was fighting for the woman he loved, but their victory would be short-lived. The man who had fled into the darkness was riding for help, and the help that was coming would carry badges. 3 days later, the law arrived. Not Sheriff Mills, but a U.S. Marshal named William Cross, a man with a reputation as cold and hard as a tombstone. Cross didn't deal in nuance, he dealt in bodies. "Thomas Whitmore," Cross announced, dismounting from his horse with a theatrical slowness, "you're under arrest." "Arrest for what?" Thomas demanded, his wounded shoulder throbbing. For harboring a known Apache combatant, Cross said, his voice flat, and for providing aid and comfort to an enemy of the territorial government. She's not a combatant, Thomas shot back. She's a woman whose family was murdered in cold blood. Cross's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. According to our information, this woman participated in the unprovoked attack on 8 law-abiding citizens on Christmas Eve. 3 men are dead. We have a witness who saw an Apache warrior firing arrows from the darkness. The ground seemed to fall away beneath Thomas's feet. The witness, the man who had fled. The men who had come to his home to murder him in the night were now the victims. And he, and the woman who had saved his life, were the killers. The world had been turned completely upside down. Those men came here to kill us, Thomas roared, the injustice of it choking him. She was defending herself, defending me. That, Marshal Cross said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt, will be for a judge to decide. You're both coming with me. The trial in Copper Ridge was a farce from the moment the gavel fell. The courtroom was packed with the same faces that had stared at him with cold contempt for months. His former friends, his business partners, they were all there to see him fall. Judge Harrison Pike presided, his face a mask of bored impartiality. But Thomas knew the verdict had been decided before the first witness was even called. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of fiction. The surviving attackers, cleaned up and looking like respectable citizens, took the stand one by one. They testified that they had ridden to the Whitmore Ranch on Christmas Eve simply to talk, to try and reason with him. According to their story, Thomas and his Apache concubine had opened fire without any provocation, forcing them to defend themselves. It was a clear-cut case of murder. Thomas's lawyer, a young, earnest man named David Preston, was the only one in town who would take the case. He fought hard, but it was like trying to punch his way through a brick wall. The final devastating blow came from Sheriff Duncan Mills. He took the stand, the very picture of a reluctant, duty-bound lawman. I warned Mr. Whitmore, Mills testified, his voice full of phony regret. I told him he was playing with fire, but he refused to listen. In my professional opinion, he had become emotionally entangled. To what extent? The prosecutor asked, leading him on. I believe, Mills said, pausing for dramatic effect as he looked at the jury, that they were engaged in an intimate relationship. It clouded his judgment, made him turn against his own people. A wave of shocked gasps and angry murmurs swept through the courtroom. Thomas felt Ayanna stiffen beside him, her face burning with a shame and humiliation that was more painful than any physical blow. The damage was done. The lie was perfect. In the eyes of the court, in the eyes of the whole world, he wasn't a man who had stood up for what was right. He was a race traitor, a fool who had thrown away everything for a savage woman. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The sentence was death. For both of them. As they were dragged from the courtroom, back to the cold jail cells, Thomas caught sight of them. The men who had attacked his ranch, the men who had lied on the stand. They were shaking hands with Sheriff Mills, their faces glowing with triumph. Justice, Copper Ridge style, had been served. That night in the suffocating darkness of their adjacent cells, Ayanna's voice came as a soft whisper through the bars. I am sorry. For what? Thomas asked, his own voice sounding hollow and defeated. For this. For destroying your life. For costing you everything. He reached through the bars, his fingers finding hers in the dark. Her hand was so small, so cold. He held it tight. You didn't destroy anything, he said, the truth of the words a small, defiant light in the overwhelming darkness. You showed me what was real. He thought of his ranch, his money, his reputation, all of it built on the approval of men like Duncan Mills. All of it gone in an instant. And now we die for it, she whispered. Maybe, he said, but we'll die knowing we stood for something. The sound of a key scraping in a lock startled them. The cell door creaked open. Standing there, silhouetted against the dim light of a lantern, was the last person on earth he expected to see. Maria Santos, his quiet, timid housekeeper. She held a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with fear and determination. She was holding a heavy set of keys. "Quickly," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You do not have much time." She had bribed the night deputy with a bag of gold coins Thomas had hidden under a floorboard in his office. A wagon and two fast horses were waiting in the alley behind the jail. Thomas stared at her, dumbfounded. He had always been kind to her, paid her well, but this was an act of incredible bravery. She was risking her own life for them. "Maria, why?" "Because you are a good man, Senor Whitmore," she said, pressing a bundled-up rifle into his hands. "And good men should not die for being good. Now go. Vaya con Dios." They slipped out into the pre-dawn chill, the air crisp and cold against their faces. They scrambled into the wagon and then onto the horses, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, Copper Ridge slept, confident that its monsters were safely locked away. They rode hard, north toward the mountains, toward the promise of freedom. But Thomas knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was not over. Sheriff Mills could not afford to have them alive. He had covered up a massacre and framed an innocent man. He wouldn't just let them ride away. The manhunt would be swift, and it would be merciless. This wasn't an escape. It was just a head start. For 3 days, they lived like hunted animals. They rode through treacherous canyons and across windswept mesas, pushing their horses and themselves to the absolute limit. Ayana was their guide, her knowledge of the land their only advantage. She led them along ancient game trails and through hidden passes that wouldn't appear on any white man's map. She moved with a purpose and a certainty that left Thomas in awe. This was her world. Behind them, the posse was never far. They could feel their presence, a constant pressure at their backs. It was led by Sheriff Mills himself, a man now driven by a desperate need to bury his secrets forever. On the 4th day, as their horses faltered from exhaustion and their own strength began to fail, they found it. Tucked away in a high, secluded valley, hidden by pine and snow, was the Apache camp. A tall, weathered man with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 winters emerged from a lodge. It was Grey Wolf, Ayana's father. He showed no emotion as he saw his daughter, the child he thought was long dead, ride into his camp. But Thomas saw the slight tremor in the old chief's hand as he reached out to embrace her, and in that small, involuntary movement, he saw a father's love, deep and boundless. The reunion was a bittersweet miracle. The band had been decimated. Fewer than 30 people remained, mostly women, children, and old men. The few warriors left were scarred and haunted, the last remnants of a proud people who were being systematically erased. Through Ayana's translation, Thomas told the chief everything: the attack on his ranch, the trial, the escape. He explained that a posse was close behind, led by the same man who had orchestrated the original massacre of Grey Wolf's people. "My father says you are welcome here," Ayana told Thomas after a long, somber conversation with the chief. "But he warns that we cannot stay. The soldiers will come with the spring thaw. Even if we survive your sheriff, we are living on borrowed time." Thomas looked at the faces around the fire. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw an unbreakable dignity. They had lost everything, but they had not lost who they were. He thought of his own life, the one he had lost in Copper Ridge. The ranch, the money, the respect. It all felt like a dream from another lifetime. It was meaningless compared to this, to the raw, desperate struggle for survival, for family, for freedom. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. "North," Ayana said, a distant look in her eyes. "There is a place they call Canada. The British there. They are more willing to let our people live. It is a long, hard journey. Many will not survive it." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "But those who do will be free." That night, a decision formed in Thomas's heart. It was not a choice made with his mind, but with his soul. He had spent his life building an empire of dirt and cattle. Here, among the ruins of a nation, he had found something real, a purpose. He stood up and walked over to Grey Wolf, with Ayana at his side to translate. "I want to help," Thomas said, his voice ringing with a conviction he had never felt before. "I have money hidden, accounts in banks far from here. I know the country between here and the border. Let me help you get your people to safety." The old chief studied him for a long, silent moment, his gaze seeming to pierce right through to Thomas's soul. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Ayana smiled as she translated. He says you have already sacrificed more than any man should have to. He asked why you would give up even more. Thomas didn't look at the chief. He looked at Ayana. He saw the woman who had fought for him, who had stood by him, who had risked everything for him. He saw the woman who had taught him the difference between having a reputation and having character. Because your daughter, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, taught me what loyalty really means. But before they could plan their journey north, the world outside their hidden valley intruded. A scout, one of Grey Wolf's young warriors, came sprinting into the camp, his face pale with alarm. He had seen them, riders, a dozen of them, heavily armed, making their way up the canyon. It was Mills. He had found them. The time for running was over. Panic rippled through the small camp. But Grey Wolf raised a hand, and a tense silence fell. His face was grim, but his eyes were clear. There were only 7 warriors left, including the chief himself. They were outnumbered and outgunned. A direct fight would be a suicide mission, a final, futile gesture of defiance. But Thomas saw something else. He saw the canyon walls, the thick stands of pine, the treacherous, snow-covered ground. This wasn't a battlefield of Mills's choosing. This was Apache land, and they weren't going to fight like soldiers. They were going to fight like ghosts. We can't fight them head-on, Thomas said quickly to Ayana. We have to use the terrain, set traps, pick them off one by one. Ayana translated, her voice sharp and urgent. Grey Wolf listened, his eyes flicking from Thomas to the canyon entrance. He nodded slowly. It was their only chance. What followed was a desperate, frantic scramble. The women and children were herded into a hidden cave system higher up the mountain. The warriors, guided by Grey Wolf's lifetime of knowledge and Thomas's understanding of how his own people fought, prepared for battle. They set deadfalls, tripwires, and snares. They positioned themselves on the high ridges, bows drawn, rifles ready. Thomas found himself side by side with Ayana on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main trail. He held his rifle, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in his hands. She held her father's warbow, an arrow already knocked on the string. They looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. They heard the posse before they saw them, the crunch of hooves on snow, the low murmur of voices. Duncan Mills rode at the front, his face a mask of grim determination. He was so close to burying his secret forever. He rode directly under a massive snow-laden pine branch, where one of Grey Wolf's warriors lay in wait. With a swift cut of his knife, the warrior severed a rope. The branch, weighing hundreds of pounds, crashed down. It missed Mills, but it struck the man directly behind him, crushing both rider and horse in a sickening explosion of snow and splintered bone. The canyon erupted in chaos. Mills's men scattered, firing wildly into the trees. But they were shooting at phantoms. An arrow hissed from the ridge, and another man fell, clutching his throat. A rifle shot echoed from the opposite wall, and a deputy spun from his saddle. It was a turkey shoot. The posse was trapped, exposed, and being dismantled piece by piece. They were terrified, fighting an enemy they couldn't see. "Fall back! Fall back!" Mills screamed, his voice raw with fury and panic. He spurred his horse, retreating down the trail. But Thomas and Ayana were waiting. As Mills galloped past their position, Thomas raised his rifle. He had a clear shot. He could end it all, right here, right now, put a bullet in the man who had destroyed his life. But he hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Ayana let her arrow fly. It wasn't aimed at Mills. It was aimed at his horse. The arrow struck the animal's flank. The horse screamed, reared up, and sent the sheriff tumbling into a deep snowdrift. He came up sputtering, his pistol drawn, his eyes wild with hate. He was on foot, trapped. The surviving members of his posse, seeing their leader thrown, didn't stop to help him. They fled, galloping back down the canyon in a desperate rout. Duncan Mills was alone. He stared up at the ridge, his face contorted with rage, and saw them. Thomas and Ayana looking down at him. "Whitmore!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You coward! Face me like a man!" Thomas looked at Ayana. This was it, the final confrontation. He began to climb down from the ridge, his rifle held ready. This had to end, one way or another. He met Mills in a small clearing. The snow was trampled and stained with blood. The air was thick with the smell of pine and gunpowder. "It's over, Duncan," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Not until you're dead," Mills spat, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the tension. "Sheriff!" One of the deputies, a young kid named Miller, had returned. He sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He had seen enough. "Sheriff," the young deputy said, his voice shaking. "I heard what they said back at the trial. I didn't believe it. But this, ambushing us like this, these people were just defending themselves, weren't they?" Mills glanced at the deputy, his eyes full of contempt. "Shut up, you fool, they're murderers." "No," the deputy said, his voice growing stronger. "The men you brought with you, they were the same ones from the Christmas attack. I recognize them. You lied. You lied about everything." The confession hung in the frozen air. The truth was out. Mills seemed to crumble. His grand deception, the web of lies he had so carefully constructed, had just been torn apart by a boy with a conscience. His face twisted into a snarl of pure animalistic rage. If he was going down, he was taking Whitmore with him. He lunged, firing his pistol. The shot went wide as Thomas dove into the snow. Mills stood over him, ready to fire again, a triumphant, crazed look in his eyes. And then an arrow appeared in his chest. He looked down at the feathered shaft, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He staggered back, dropped his pistol, and fell to his knees. He looked up at the ridge one last time, at the woman who had brought him down. Then he collapsed face first into the snow, his blood staining it a brilliant, shocking red. It was over. The journey north was brutal. Winter's icy breath was a constant companion, and the trail was littered with hardship and heartbreak. They lost 2 elders to the biting cold, and a young child to a fever that burned too hot, too fast. Each loss was a fresh wound, a painful reminder of the price of their freedom. But they never stopped. Led by Grey Wolf's wisdom, Ayanna's strength, and Thomas's resourcefulness, the small band of survivors pushed onward. Thomas used his hidden funds, wiring money ahead to towns along their route, ensuring that fresh supplies and horses were always waiting. He was no longer a cattle king, but a shepherd, guiding his new family toward the promised land. 27 souls crossed the border into Canadian territory. They were ragged, exhausted, and scarred, but they were alive, and they were free. With his remaining wealth, Thomas purchased a vast tract of land near the foothills of the Rockies. It was a place of soaring peaks, clear rivers, and deep forests, a place where a people could heal. He helped them build a new home, not a temporary camp, but a permanent settlement. He used his business sense to establish trade with the local towns, ensuring that Grey Wolf's people would not just survive, but thrive. He and Ayanna were married in a ceremony that blended the old ways and the new, a symbol of the world they were building together. In time, they had 3 children, sons and daughters who were raised to speak both English and Apache, to be proud of the rancher's blood and the warrior's spirit that flowed in their veins. Back in Arizona, the story of Thomas Whitmore became a cautionary tale. Deputy Miller's testimony exposed the corruption and the massacre, and the territorial government was forced to clean house. But in the saloons and general stores, the whispers painted a different picture. They spoke of a man who had gone mad, who had thrown away a fortune and a legacy for a savage. They never understood. They couldn't. They saw a man who had lost everything. They never knew that he had found something so much more valuable. Years passed. The settlement grew. The laughter of children replaced the echoes of gunfire. Thomas Whitmore grew old, his hair turning the color of the mountain snow, his face lined with the maps of a life well lived. He died peacefully in his bed at the age of 71, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Ayanna was there, holding his hand, her own face a beautiful canvas of love and time. "Was it worth it?" she whispered, her voice still holding the melody he had fallen in love with all those years ago. He looked at her, at the woman who was his life, his partner, his heart. He thought of the man he had been and the man he had become. Every moment, he whispered, his last breath a sigh of contentment. Every sacrifice, it all led me to you. The man who once owned the largest ranch in Arizona left behind no great fortune, no stone monuments, but his legacy was written in the faces of his children, in the freedom of a people who had refused to be broken, and in the quiet truth that a man's worth is not measured by what he owns, but by what he is willing to fight for. If you were moved by this story of incredible sacrifice and unbreakable loyalty, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I have to ask you, let me know in the comments below. When Thomas first found Ayanna by that creek bed, what would you have done? Would you have ridden away? We'll see you in the next story.